morning to you. Today we are talking about the ethics of generative AI. What does it mean to use it in our classroom? And where exactly is this data being generated from? Okay, there we go. We did have ourselves a bit of a false start this morning because the show started, but apparently my microphone did not want to wake up this morning. I think it's because the computer knows that technology is not our favorite thing on the show today. But we are here. It is Saturday, the 8th. Yes, the 8th of March. 2025. I'm surprised that it's March, quite frankly. It kind of occurred to me yesterday when somebody was telling me about a holiday they were taking at the beginning of April. And, I made the correct attitudes. I was like, oh, that's nice. Nice. We were looking forward to it. And then it was only a couple of minutes later when I actually processed what was going on that I realized that their holiday was in like 3 weeks. So I was able to go back and have an actual conversation about it. But it did for a moment occur to me to think, why are you telling me about your holiday in April when that's so far away? And no, it's really not. But we are here. We are today talking about generative AI and its place in the classroom. Now, as long-term friends of the show will know, I am a big EdTech supporter. I believe in making use of technology. I believe that our children are going into a technologically advanced world. I don't want to say workplace because over the past couple of weeks I've had issues with employability and how everything is all about going into the workplace instead of learning things just because they're interesting, learning things just for personal enrichment, learning things because it's fun. So I don't want to say that they're going into a technologically enriched workplace, even though they are, but they're going into a technologically enriched world. And as we know, our young people are not really prepared for it. They are not, as much as we want to think that they are a technologically adept generation, they're not. They spend a lot of time on their tech. They spend a lot of time on their phones, on their tablets, on their games consoles. But all of those things are designed for ease of use. So, you don't ever have to, on the popular social media these days, you don't ever have to actually think about anything. You can swipe, you can flick, you can press 2 buttons and something is uploaded. It's not multi-step, and it's designed that way, which I actually quite appreciate. I like when things are designed for ease of use, but it does mean that our young people are coming out of school, they're going into the world, still not really able to do multi-step operations on the computer, office software, things that we were trained in at school during our ICT lessons. They do still tends to be a bit of a mystery. The number of times, even in year 10, in year 11, so, when these kids are 16, I've had to explain how to make something bold on a document. I've had to explain how to read my comments when you do the add comment thing in Word. I've had to show them how to go in and find those. And so, the technology, certainly over the last almost 20 years that I've been teaching, has come on leaps and bounds. I trained as a primary school teacher, and one of the things that we had to do, one of the things that we had to show in every lesson was our use of ICT, because that was the big up and coming thing. And quite often that was as simple as, I've used a PowerPoint in this lesson. I've turned my interactive whiteboard on. I've had the children come up and move something from one side of the board to the other. We kind of embraced the technology back then, the burgeoning technology, kind of as it was. And so it has been kind of drilled into me as part of my practice to make sure that I'm using technology to make sure that I'm equipping my children to use it. And, I do very much appreciate it. I think one of the things that I took from lockdown, and, I've spoken about this before, is how much of my teaching can be enriched by being online. That's why I've made the transition into a predominantly online environment. I would say these days about 90% of my teaching is done online. And I like that because, as a language teacher, as a classicist, I can call on so many resources when my students have them there at their fingertips. So I want to just kind of, open the show by making it very clear that I'm not an anti-technology person. I'm not one of those, AI is going to come and take our jobs, although that is a point that I will make a little bit later on, but not in terms of teaching. Um, so, I want to be clear that I'm kind of not prejudiced against generative AI and its use in school, from a place of technophobia. And in fact, I'm going to be very transparent. I've used generative AI in my teaching. I've used it to produce really quick worksheets if I've needed to. I have used it for creating reading comprehensions. Things that have saved me a lot of time, because that's the big selling point of generative AI, isn't it? Is that it saves us a lot of time. And so, I attended the courses. I saw how the generative AI technologies worked. I was really excited by them. I didn't really think about the ethics behind them. And I should have done. Again, for reasons that I will explain later. The ethics behind where this information comes from should have been in the forefront of my mind, but it didn't occur to me, and nobody kind of pointed it out in any of the training that I had done, which is fair, because the training that I've done, it's all been training on how to use the technology, not on the ethical issues surrounding it. And so that's kind of what I want to get into today, because I feel like this is missing a little bit from the conversation that we are having about generative AI, and this kind of shift towards AI, in the classroom and in the workplace in general. So yeah, that's what we are going to be talking about today. If you have any views, if you have any opinions, then please do get in touch. If you are listening live via the Podbean app, then you can text straight into the app. Your text appears on my screen. I will read it out, because I'm assuming that if you are texting in, then you are happy for me to read it out on air. If you don't want me to, that's absolutely fine. Just let me know in the message, preferably at the start, because I do quite often just start reading before I think about it. So yeah, please do text in if you've got anything to say, and we can engage that way. If you are listening to me live elsewhere, if you are not listening via the Podbean app right now, you can get in touch with me via Blue Sky and X. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER on both of those. Again, I will read your messages out here on air, and we can engage that way. And if you are listening back and you want to engage with me, but this is not live, so if it is not 9:12 a.m. GMT on Saturday, the 8th of March for you right now, you can still get in touch with me via those social media because, as I always say, I choose to talk about topics that I'm interested in, and hopefully I will be perennially interested in them. So I will always be here to chat with you about these things.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Cat Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncatbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
In this week's education news, The Guardian, The Standard, and several other newspapers report that the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, pledges to tackle chronic skills shortages by abolishing the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education and replacing it with a new body called Skills England. The bill, which will transfer the functions of the Apprenticeships and Technical Education Institute, reached its second reading in the House of Commons and was passed by 317 votes 55. In support of the bill, Phillipson said, "The skills gaps that we face in our country deny people the opportunity, the power and the freedom to choose the life that they want to live." Critics of the bill argued that the new body, Skills England, will not be truly independent and will not have the respect of the profession. Phillipson responded by saying this approach was necessary because of the urgency of the skills shortage. Periodical Schools Week carries the story of ex-schools inspectors who have launched the alternative big consultation on Ofsted report cards. Former senior officials behind the alternative big listen last year fear that current proposals to change the inspection system are being presented as take it or leave it. Frank Norris and Colin Richards have therefore created the Alternative Big Consultation to independently gather opinions on plans for new report cards. The survey, which launched this week and closes on April the 4th, will run alongside Ofsted's own official 12-week consultation, which closes on April the 28th. The Alternative Big Consultation comprises the same questions as the government's own consultation on the plans, but also asks respondents if they believe the proposals are fit for purpose. Many teachers and school leaders have expressed their view on the proposed report card model that it's hardly an improvement and contains many of the weaknesses of the previous system. Also in the news this week, the Daily Express covered a story with the title "Save Our School Playtime." It went on to explain that experts warn of dire consequences as the break times in schools are cut. A report by the Raising the Nation Play Commission found outdoor playtime at school is being squeezed out of children's lives and must be restored. The Guardian carried a story under the headline "Ministers urged to add audio books to England's new schools curriculum." A poll by the National Literacy Trust found that children's enjoyment of listening to audio and podcasts had risen compared to the previous year, overtaking their enjoyment of reading for the first time since the charity began asking about audio in 2020. The charity said it was therefore advocating for increased access to and a broadening of the variety of reading formats available to pupils, to include audio. Jonathan Douglas of the NLT stated, "In recent years, we've seen a steady rise in children's enjoyment of listening to audio and uncovered the myriad benefits it can bring, from sparking a love of reading to deepening learning and boosting well-being." PES Magazine reported this week that primary school PE training was woefully inadequate. As reported to MPs, the chief executive of Youth Sport Trust called for PE to become a core subject to drive up standards and improve fitness. Giving evidence to the Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee, Ali Oliver called for PE to become a core curriculum subject with much higher status, and she told the committee that training problems were exacerbating the situation where there were 41,000 fewer hours in 2020-23 compared to 2011 and 12. Less than half of children are getting what the Chief Medical Officer recommends as the minimum amount of activity. More worryingly, we know that 30% of children get less than 30 active minutes a day. LBC News reported that a teacher was sacked after a joke about whacking a pupil over the head was misunderstood. Lakshmi Subrian, who had taught for over 35 years, was sacked after a school child who spoke English as a second language misunderstood the comment. The teacher was dismissed from Gilbert Colvin Primary School in Ilford, East London in 2023 following the incident. Miss Subrian took the school to an employment tribunal, claiming the remark had been made in jest while teaching Year 6 pupils and preparing them for their maths SAT exam. Speaking at the disciplinary hearing in July 2023, she said the child's decision to continue attending her after-school club showed they had not been that upset. However, she lost the appeal. Teachers' unions supporting Miss Subrian argue that this case adds to the vulnerability many teachers feel when a single ill-judged remark could end a career. And finally, a piece of research by the British Educational Research Association. Like many pieces of research, it shows something we might have always suspected was true. In their paper, A Century of Educating Britain's Political Elite, Privilege Masquerading as Meritocracy, they show how Oxbridge and private schools, called in Britain public schools, dominate the selection of cabinet ministers and prime ministers. Oxbridge educated 14 of 21 prime ministers between 1922 and 2022. Unsurprisingly, they conclude that the concentration of elite formation systems raises concerns that their graduates will suffer from groupthink. Analysing a series of important decisions made across the 20th century, it seems certain attitudes, such as the necessity to accept neoliberalist economics, the importance of Britain as a world power, and above all, the acceptance of class privilege itself, go unchallenged. Well, there's a surprise. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News, brought to you by John Gibbs.
As ever, thank you, John, for that interesting roundup of this week's news. So, we're talking about the ethics of generative AI today. I've already done my little disclaimer about how I am an edtech proponent, very much in favor of using the technology as it is made available to us. What I will do now is make my second disclaimer, which is that I'm not any kind of edtech expert. I like the technology. I will use the technology. I try to be an early adopter as much as possible, which is why, as I've already said, I have used generative AI in my teaching, but I can't claim to understand it particularly well. I would like to, my brain just doesn't really work that way. So as always, everything that I'm going to talk to you about today comes from people much cleverer than I am, who actually understand how this stuff works. And I will cite my sources as I go along. But if I do have any edtech experts listening, and I mess up, if I get something wrong, then please do let me know so that I can correct myself. I'm always happy to course correct. And I think that's really important when we are discussing something as important as ethics. I think it is very important to be open to course correcting, to be very clear about where your own gaps in knowledge lie, and be ready to listen to people who are better trained, who are more knowledgeable than you are about these things. So let's start with what generative AI actually is. Because I don't know about you, but for me, this AI boom seemed to come out of nowhere. Now, AI was everywhere when I was younger. It was all over every science fiction program that I watched. There was some kind of, in inverted commas, AI. I have visions of robots. I have visions of talking watches. I have visions of computers that will respond to you when you speak, all of which now exist. And so, kind of, when I was growing up, that was the impression that I had of AI. I kind of saw it as this really cool, really futuristic way of living. Um, and what we've ended up with isn't that. What we've ended up with are websites, are applications on the phone, are things that are built into computer programs that you might not necessarily realize are there until you read about it on social media. Um, and so it's kind of, for me, it's snuck up on us. And it's just kind of appeared. And as we do in education, because we like to be at the forefront of these things, because we like to make sure that our children, our young people, are getting the very best education that they can with the tools that we have to offer them that education. We've kind of jumped on it, and we are once again attempting to be at the forefront of it, attempting to lead the way. But until a couple of weeks ago, if you had asked me what generative AI actually was, I don't think I could have told you. I could have told you what websites to go to. I could have told you where you can learn about it, but I couldn't actually have told you what it was. So I went to somewhere more intelligent than I am, that I presume knows about these things, and I called on MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Because they've got technology right there in their name. They are well known, well respected around the world for their use of tech. So I thought, right, if anybody is going to explain to me what we mean when we say AI in a realistic way, as opposed to on all those sci-fi shows that I liked when I was younger, and let's be honest, that I still like to watch now, um, it's going to be them. And I learned some really interesting things. So, kind of everything that I'm going to say over the next couple of minutes, just whilst we kind of define our terms, this comes from a 2023 article by Adam Zewa. I hope. Not that Adam is going to hear this, but I do hope I pronounced his name correctly. But I will, again, I will make this article available on my social media later on so that you can go and check out my sources. But this is this has been a really interesting thing to think about. Adam starts off by talking about what AI always has been. So, up until the past few years, AI has typically been a machine learning model that is used to make a prediction based on a data set. And Adam gives the example of in medicine, an AI can be shown thousands and thousands of x rays, and it can be trained to notice certain signs of a tumor. And so then, when an x ray is fed through the AI, it can scan it to look at these signs. And I think that's a brilliant use of AI. I think that's great because it can very quickly be trained on these thousands and thousands of x rays, much quicker than a human doctor could go through and look at these x-rays. It presumably, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know, but presumably it will free up some time for the doctors because the AI can be used to check for signs of the tumor in the x-ray, and then that can be followed up with the doctor. I I'm not gonna lie, I feel like if I were the person who had the x ray, I would still want a human doctor to have a look at it just in case the AI has missed something because, machine error. But then we also have human error. I kind of don't know. I guess I would hope that they would cancel it out. And if you've had this AI kind of looking over the X-ray and it doesn't spot something, but the human doctor does, then that compensates, and vice versa. But again, I don't really know. But traditionally, when we've talked about AI, that's what we've meant. It hasn't produced anything. It hasn't generated anything. It has been used as a tool to spot things, as a tool to make predictions, I suppose, to say, based on what I'm looking at and based on the thousands of things that I've seen before, this is likely. In economics, Adam gives the example of whether a borrower's personal circumstances means they are likely to default on a loan. Now, again, with that one, I'm a little bit more skeptical because I want to believe that everybody's circumstances are different, and that just because somebody in very similar circumstances to you before has defaulted on a loan, that doesn't mean that you should be denied on the grounds that you are likely to default. But then you have to wonder whether we are as unique and individual as we like to think we are, or is it a case of patterns of behavior can be spotted? And, if 1,000 people before you in exactly the same situation as you, because your situation isn't as unique as you would like it to think, have defaulted on the loan, then you probably will too. So I think in this case, there are lots of instances where you have to think about whether we are as unique as we would like to be, whether pattern spotting is as useful as we think it is, and then kind of where that line is drawn between taking a chance on somebody, which, let's be honest, banks always do when they loan, and not. And I think, for me, the difference between those two examples is that one of them helps and the other hinders. So with the X-ray, it theoretically helps the person going through the X-ray because the tumor has been spotted, or the potential signs of a tumor have been spotted. Whereas in the case of the loan, it hinders the individual because they are being punished if they don't get their loan just because people in similar circumstances before have defaulted. But it helps the bank because it protects the bank from a potential default. So I guess it depends on whose side you are. Whether you're on the side of the person trying to take out the loan because she needs money to help with the mortgage, whatever it might be, or are you on the side of the bank protecting their assets? And again, I can't help but wonder whether that comes down to individual circumstance. And so is using pattern recognition the best way to figure that out? And again, I don't know. This is why we've got a show, is because I don't have any easy answers to these things. So that is what we mean traditionally when we talk about AI. It kind of it scans and it looks for patterns. And with my linguist head on, I'm going to say that's really, really helpful. The reason that we learnt to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics was because we found the Rosetta Stone. I say we as if I had anything to do with it. This was like 100 years before I was even born. But the Rosetta Stone was found, and it had exactly the same text in three languages, one of which was hieroglyphics, the other two people could speak. And so they were able to spot patterns within the hieroglyphics, compare them to patterns within the languages that were spoken, and then unlock that language. So, as a linguist, I am very much aware of the power of pattern spotting. And I do quite often think that my own ability to spot patterns is what makes me a competent linguist. The fact that I can look at a verb, I can see what letters are on the end, and so I can tell you what tense that's in, because that's just the pattern of that tense, is why I can do my job. So I'm not saying that that pattern spotting is a bad thing, and I'm not saying that it's something that only AI can do. But can AI scan a corpus for patterns much faster than I can? Absolutely. I did that in my master's degree back in 2009. I was using corpus software to scan databases to find very specific examples of specific patterns that I was writing my thesis about. So it is, as a tool, very, very powerful, very, very useful, very, very time consuming. No, it's not. It's the opposite. It's time saving, because the corpus software could do that much, much faster than I could with a highlighter, even though it's not quite as fun. But that's not what we mean when we talk about generative AI, which is the kind of AI we mean at the moment when we talk about using AI. We talk about these generative systems. So generative AI is a machine learning model that is trained to create new data. So traditionally, AI just spots patterns in data that is already fed. It's not creating anything new. Generative AI is creating something, in inverted commas, new. It generates. That's why it's called generative. And so it kind of learns to create things based on the data that it has looked at. And it's kind of based on this thing called a Markov chain. So a Markov chain, named after Andrei Markov, who was a Russian mathematician from the early 1900s, is pretty much predictive text. So a Markov chain kind of looks back at the last 3 or 4 words that you have typed, and based on all of the data that it's been trained on, makes a guess at what word you want to type next. And that's where we get our swipe to insert this word idea from. That's been around forever. Predictive text has pretty much been a thing ever since we got rid of having to press, 7 4 times to get a T. And we've just had our on-screen keyboards. We've been using predictive text forever. So in that kind of framework, we've been using generative AI for a very long time, because our text production program was generating the word that it thought we wanted to say next. And quite often it's right. Or quite often it's not the word that we wanted to say next, but you look at it and you go, oh, close enough, and you swipe anyway because it still makes sense within the context of the sentence that you're writing. The difference between that traditional Markov model and what we use for generative AI these days is that the generative AI at the moment can work much further back, and it can predict much further forward. So with the traditional predictive text under the Markov model, it, like I said, only looks back 2, 3, 4 words and predicts the one word that comes next. And it then kind of resets itself, and it goes 2, 3, 4 words back from the word that it's just created for you. Whereas with generative AI models that we use today, it can look back at your entire prompt. Even if it's a prompt that's a paragraph long, it can look all the way back. It can look all the way back on itself in terms of what it's producing. What word has come first? Right, so the next word is going to be this one. Then after these 2 words, it's going to be this third. After these 3 words, it's going to be this fourth. And it can look forwards. So it can produce this huge, great big long text. I actually don't know what character limits are. I will, when we listen to the adverts again in a little while, I'll see if I can find it out. But it can produce this really long text that reads relatively authentically. Relatively. So that's kind of what it's doing. It's predictive text, but it's predictive text on steroids. It's predictive text taken to an extreme. And, let's not lie about this. It's impressive. What it can do is very impressive. I can go into a text generating program. I can say to it, please produce a GCSE foundation level French text on the theme of environment, and then ask some multiple choice questions after it. And it will do that at the correct level, using words just from the specification, because it knows that that's what I want based on what other people have asked. And it can produce in 90 seconds a worksheet that would probably take me about half an hour to write. And so it is really, really impressive in that regard. It is very, very powerful in that regard. But let's be very, very clear that what it's doing is predicting. It's a prediction model. And, that's why we always get that caveat of checking it before you submit it to anything, because it can make mistakes. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But, quite often it looks good. And quite often you read it and you go, yeah, that's perfect. That's fine. I'm going to print that off and dish it out to my kids. That's tomorrow morning's lesson sorted, or, whatever it might be. And for me, it was very easy to get sucked into that and to start thinking about how much time it can save, and to start thinking about, what else I can do, how I can plan better lessons because the generative AI is generating my worksheets for me. What I didn't think about, and what I really should have thought about, was exactly where these data that it was being trained on were coming from.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
So let's think about those data sets then, because as we've established, generative AI doesn't create wholesale. It doesn't create from scratch. It doesn't have a brain. in the same way that we do, that can create something from nothing. And again, I know that that's a bit of a controversial statement because we all know the old adage that there are only 7 stories, and we keep retelling the same stories over and over again, but in different settings with different characters, whatever that may be. But generative AI itself doesn't wholesale come up with anything. Like I said, it's a very sophisticated predictive text model, and it is trained on existing data. And kind of when I had my revelation about why maybe generative AI is not ethically the correct thing for us to be using in our classroom, it was these data sets that I got a little bit obsessed with, that I really wanted to find out more about. So I went to a website. Again, I'm not a computer scientist. I don't understand this stuff. So I went to people who understand it better than I do. And I went to potterclarkson.com. And they've got a very helpful article called "What Data is Used to Train an AI?" That should be what data are used, but I make that mistake too, so we're not going to come down too hard on them. Where does it come from, and who owns it? And according to this article, there are 3 types of data that are used throughout the stages of generative AI development. You've got the training data, which are the data used to train the AI model. So the data that the AI model looks through in order to find these patterns that we've talked about. You've got the test data. So that's the data that is used to test the AI model that is then compared to other models. And then you've got the validation data. Those are the data used to validate the final AI model. So, the scientists creating the AI, they are doing a very thorough job on making sure that the AI are trained fully, and that there are all of these different comparisons. And these training data, they can be both structured or unstructured. So structured training data is in the form of tables, for example, or pages of text, whereas unstructured data come in the form of audio and video and images. And there are all kinds of places that these data can come from. As I said, back when I did my master's degree, I was using corpus data. So those are huge databases that are compiled specifically for academic use. And what for me is really important about that is that the data that is in the corpora, the data that are in the corpora, see, I made the mistake then. They are there because the people involved in the production of the data know that they are there. Or because the data are out of copyright, and so they are freely able to be there. If data are in a corpus, then it's designed to be used for things like this. You've got internal data. So perhaps you as a business, you are deciding to create an AI model, a generative AI model, and you are using data from within your own business to train that model because you want to make it very specific to you. Again, that theoretically, absolutely fine, because you as the business have decided that that's how the data are going to be used. Presumably you have informed the people working in your business that that's how the data is going to be used. That's all good. Vendors, creators of other websites can choose to sell data. And, we know that that's a big controversy about whether or not different websites have the right to sell your data. How many times have you seen on Facebook that post that goes around about how Facebook has changed its terms and conditions and they can now sell on your posts, but if you post that you don't give permission, then that makes it okay. But we all know that that doesn't make it okay, because if Facebook, and I'm just using them as an example because that's the traditional one, but every social media sites can do the same thing. If it's within their terms and conditions that they can take your data and use it to train AI, use it to sell, then that's what they can do, because they have already told you that within their terms and conditions, and so that's okay. Because you signed up to those terms and conditions when you agreed to it. There was a big furore in 2023 when Reddit started charging for access to its API, which presumably, we don't know this for certain, but was presumably in response to certain generative AI websites wanting to use its data, the posts that are made on Reddit, to train their AI models. So essentially, AI get their data from the internet. In some cases, that's completely legal. It's completely fine. You have signed over your right for whatever you've posted on the internet to be used in data training sets. And so that makes it ethically okay. Please do check the terms and conditions of every website that you post on to make sure that you know what is being done with your data. And please remember that your data does not just mean your name and address and date of birth and all of that sign-up information. It also means things that you post on that website. So just, make sure that you're on top of that. Because other ways that generative AI can be trained is by combing the internet for any data that are public facing, even if permission has not been given. Now, again, I'm not accusing any AI company of doing that. I'm not suggesting that is a thing that is happening. I'm saying that it's a thing that could happen feasibly. And so, again, I think for those of us that create things, we've got to be really, really careful. And this is where I kind of kicked myself when I started thinking about the ethical issues behind the use of generative AI. Because I am a creative person. In my pre-teaching career, I was an actor, I was a singer. I produce textbooks, I write the occasional blog post. I am here talking to you right now. All of the stuff that I create is content. And theoretically, anything that I have created and that I have put out there could be mined, could be used to train generative AI. And kind of what really drove this home for me was when I learned about an AI model that will produce podcasts. Because I thought, this AI, it doesn't have its own voice. It hasn't got a voice box. It doesn't have vocal cords. So these voices that it's producing, they must come from somewhere. That there must be somebody's vocal data out there somewhere that has been used to train these AI podcasts. And I really hope that the people whose voices they are know. I really hope that they know that their voices have been used to create podcasts that they have got no control over. Because, we see on the news about deep fakes and things. We learn in our child protection safeguarding training about how photos of children can be manipulated and put on the dark web. We know that these things can happen, and yet we don't, or at least I didn't, tend to think about them in terms of the AI training models. And I will never know for sure whether any of the stuff that I produce is used to train an AI model, until somebody tells me that there has been some kind of data breach and a forum that I post on, a blog hosting platform, a podcast hosting platform, whatever it might be, has been targeted and that data used to train. I won't know that. And of course, it is my responsibility to be aware. It is my responsibility to check the terms and conditions, because of course, if I sign up to, let's say, a website hosting domain and it's in their terms and conditions that anything hosted there can be used to train generative AI, and I make the choice to still host there, that is my choice, and I then can't complain if my stuff is being used. But if I don't know that, if I don't agree to that, then I have the right to complain. And I think what it boils down to for me is the fact that I don't always know. I don't always know where these data sets that the generative AI have come from. And, that is starting to sit a little bit uncomfortably with me as I'm starting to, write my thesis for my doctorate, and I'm having to cite my sources for literally everything I say. As I sit here and I talk to you about different things in school, and I do the research and I cite my sources there, it occurs to me that there is just so much out there that people have produced. And we have to take great pains to make sure that we are citing our sources. But I can't do that if I'm using generative AI to produce a worksheet, because I don't know what it was trained on. I don't know what it's pulling. Now, this isn't new. I quite often tell the story of a time I had an A-level Latin student hand in homework that had been blatantly Google translated. And I knew that it had been Google translated without even having to read it, because randomly in the middle of the sentences that she'd written, she had numbers where Google Translate had just pulled from a copy of the Bible. And she had just kind of put the translation into Google, had it do the translation, copy pasted, not proofread it, and handed it in. So, none of this is new. And that in itself, the fact that the Google Translate in that case had trained its algorithm on the Bible, that's not an issue, because the Bible is out of copyright. There's no problem with using the Bible as a data set, because there's no copyright on it. But I wonder where other things come from. And again, I'm not accusing, I'm not suggesting that anything unethical is happening. What I am saying is that I don't know where these data sets are being trained, and it is my responsibility now, as the person creating the content, as the person making the worksheet, if I use generative AI, that then is my responsibility to know where those data are coming from, I feel. And on the flip side of that, as a creative person, I would hate it if my data were being used to train an AI model and I didn't know. If the stuff that I was coming up with, the stuff that I would like to profit from, because it's come from, my work, my brain, if that were then being used for other companies to profit from, that would not sit well with me. So that, I think, is my big ethical conundrum. with generative AI is that I don't always know where the data are coming from. I don't know what the AI has been trained on, and it should be my responsibility to know that before I blindly start using things. I should know how a tool works before I start putting that tool into my practice.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Tim has texted in, good morning to you. Tim is a long-time friend of the show, and has said, something I'd like to know about how generative AI gathers its information is whether it's even possible for content to opt out for copyright or other reasons. I know search engines crawl the internet and are trained to ignore websites and content that don't align with their preferences, so surely AI gathering tools can too. Absolutely, and I like to believe that they do. The part of me that kind of wants this to work, that wants this to be a positive thing, really, really hopes that that is exactly what happens. The issue that we have, though, is one of copyright. And this is a really thorny issue because legally, anything that you create is immediately under your copyright. I remember learning about this when I was in my late teens and I just kind of started writing seriously. And I was very, very concerned that people would take my genius ideas because, you know, when you are 16, every idea you have is genius, and would attempt to benefit from them for their own. So I was like, right, how do I copyright everything that I do? And I learned that actually everything that you produce is automatically under your own copyright. The difficulty that we have, and I think the difficulty that the AI producing companies will have, is whether you hand that copyright over to the hosting website when you post it or not. So again, you know, it's a bit like the Facebook meme that we talked about before, where when you post on Facebook, are you actually handing the copyright of that text over to them? Because up until that moment you hit post, that copyright belongs to you. But depending on the terms and the conditions of the website, you may transfer that copyright over the minute it is posted because it's being hosted by them. And so I think it's very difficult to it's very difficult for a company to say, right, we're not going to train on copyrighted data because in theory all data are automatically copyrighted. You know, this podcast is in theory copyrighted to me. Whether or not I actually hand over the copyright to Teachers Talk Radio, because they are my umbrella company, whether we hand over the copyright to Podbean because they're the host, that's all to do with the terms and conditions. And so that then gets very, very murky. So that's a really difficult question to answer, I think. Now, of course, I know that that's not quite what you meant, because when we talk about copyrighted work, we mean things that have been patented, we mean things that have the little C in the circle, that have been through that process. So, works that are not in the public domain. Is it possible, for example, if we take ebooks, for example, most ebooks will have gone through a traditional publishing process, and so will be copyrighted to the publisher, as well as to the author. And so, can generative AI be trained not to use those ebook websites to train their data? And I feel like the answer is yes. And the reason that I think that is because I think that for a lot of it, it is actually an opt in situation. I am reminded of something that happened. It was actually reported just this year in The Guardian. There was a publisher, I won't name them, but there was a publisher. And they started to put into their contract a clause that actually allowed AI to train on their works. So even though, they retained the copyright, within that contract, there was this little section that said, I allow AI to train itself on my work. And because that's an opt-in process, I kind of believe, and again, maybe naively, because I want to see the good in all of this stuff, I kind of believe that that is something that that these data companies respect. And so I kind of hope that everything that I have ever produced using generative AI has been done with the full consent and understanding of the people whose data were used to train the AI. But again, kind of like I've said before, the onus is on me to know that. And because I've not found a very easy way to know that, it makes me that little bit more uncomfortable with it. And again, as a writer, as an actor, as a performer, I do read my contracts very, very carefully. I will never forget a contract that I almost signed a couple of years ago, which basically gave the publisher full control over and rights to everything that I ever published for anybody ever. So, even though this was a fiction publisher, they would technically, had I signed the contract, have had complete control and copyright over this show, for example. So I'm glad that I read my contracts carefully. But I also know that not everybody does, because when you are faced with pages and pages of terms and conditions, let's be real, you just scroll to the bottom, tick the box to say that you've read them, and then merrily go on your way. And so again, we don't know what people may have unwittingly signed up for. So even if the data collection is all above board, which I believe it is, we don't know that the people creating those data initially, the ones that the AI are being trained on, whether they actually consented to it or whether they just ticked the box because they didn't want to read the terms and conditions. And again, that's on them. And notice, I'm just realizing this as I'm speaking. Notice that I'm talking a lot about personal responsibility. It's on me as the teacher, in this case, to feel comfortable that the worksheet that I've produced with generative AI has come from copyright-free, public domain, open source, whatever it might be, data. That's my responsibility to check. Ethically, that's my responsibility to know. As a creative, as a writer, it's my responsibility to know that nowhere in my contract does it say that my data can be used to train AI if I don't want it to be. It's my responsibility as the host of Saturday Morning Breakfast to know whether or not TTR Podbean are selling my voice, for podcast generation. I can't see why they would, quite frankly. I've heard myself speak. I'm not sure why anybody would want to buy my voice. Um, but it's my responsibility to know that. So, it does, as everything when we talk about ethics, it does boil down to personal responsibility and kind of what we want to have control over, what we want to know about, what is important for us to understand. So, of course, the solution then to this particular ethical issue, this idea of copyright, of intellectual property, of citing your sources, is to be very tight with licensing data, to be very respectful of intellectual property rights, and for everybody on all sides of the equation, for the generative AI companies, for us as the creatives, for us as the teachers using the generative AI companies, everybody, just to be aware of what you're doing, be aware of what is being used. The second ethical issue, I've got 11. There's no way that I'm going to get through like 9 more in the next 20 minutes, given that I've spent so long talking about copyright. The second ethical issue is the distribution of harmful content. So there was, and I can't remember when it was, but there was a generative AI model that was trained on a very specific forum that is known to produce toxic content. And that AI was then generating hate speech, essentially. I believe the project was shut down afterwards. And I think, if I remember rightly, that whole AI creation was an experiment to see the extent to which the AI would just parrot back the data that it was trained on. But if you have got a huge AI model that is just indiscriminately using the internet as a data set, then it's going to encounter hateful speech. And so, again, because the AI doesn't have a brain, because the AI doesn't think, if within its predictive text pattern, it makes sense for that hateful speech to come up, then it will. And again, that is the responsibility of us as the teacher, the user of the generative AI, to check and censor and get rid of anything that is harmful before we hand it out to students. Because the AI company has done its due diligence. It has decided what it's going to use as a data set. And, when you are getting into billions of data points, particularly if you are not vetting each data point before you put it in, and you are just saying, use this particular website, use this particular forum as your data set, and you're not actually in control of the data that's being produced because it's being trained on stuff that random people like us are posting, you don't always know what is going to come up. So, we can say that it is up to the AI companies to implement content filters, to create ethical guidelines, to think of human oversight. But that, again, is also up to us as the teacher to go through everything that you produce and take out anything that is harmful. And again, I hope that we would, because that just seems like common sense. Why would you dish out a worksheet that you haven't read, that you haven't checked through? But again, if you are using it as a time saver, which is the way that AI is quite often positioned to us, it's the way that it's sold to us, and you are overly trusting of the model that you're using, let's be real, you may not. You may just create it, send 30 to the photocopier, and then be ready to dish it out. So there is, once again, the extra onus on us as the teacher, as the people using the generative AI, to make sure that everything is above board. Related to this, and this is my favorite piece of AI terminology that I've used as a linguist. I love this. Hallucinations. So I learned last week that AI can hallucinate. Um, Now, I've always kind of facetiously accused it of lying. Occasionally, I've accused it of not knowing what it's talking about, but apparently, the technical term is hallucination. And this is the idea that AI can create misleading information. Um, and once again, it does this because it's using a predictive text model. Ever since I've kind of started seeing and rationalizing AI as massive predictive text, it's made a lot more sense to me. So, you could ask it, let's say you are an ancient history teacher, you are teaching the Persian Empire, and so you ask it to create a list of rulers in ancient Persia that you're going to hand out and it's going to be stuck in the front of your pupils' books. So you do. And, again, don't really know where the data that your AI has been trained on has come from, because that is very difficult to find out. And it turns out that one of the places that it has been trained has been a series of self-published fantasy novels about a fictitious Persian king. And so this Persian king turns up in your list of Persian rulers. That's a hallucination. So because the AI can't discriminate between fact and fantasy, because everything it collects is seen as data rather than as individual genre, it's not necessarily going to know the difference between a real king and a fictitious one. Again, as a teacher, it is your job to scan through and just make sure that everybody on that list did actually exist. But human error, it's very easy to overlook something, to overlook somebody. If dates are a little bit wishy-washy, I'm sorry, history teachers, I'm kind of picking on history at the moment. I think it was just because I looked over and first thing I saw was my ancient history textbooks, so that was what came to mind. But if you've got for example an English king, and you're not entirely sure when he was born, because of course this was before birth records and we just keep baptismal records. And so, you don't know whether he was born in 53, 54, 55. Your generative AI may come out very clearly as saying he was born in 54. And you're then presenting that information to your kids, when in fact the truth is that we don't know. So we do need, as teachers, to verify everything that is being generated by the AI. And I know there are lots of people who are calling for AI fact-checking tools to check things that are being produced by AI, but I can't help but worry we're then just creating this cycle of AI training itself on itself and kind of perpetuating this misinformation, these lovely hallucinations. I love the idea of some kind of poor AI model sitting there just making up kings, seeing emperors that didn't exist, imagining extra elements on the periodic table. And I also think it's really sad that we are creating these AI beings, and the first thing they're doing is hallucinating, which is something that none of us would want, that none of us would want to go through.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favourite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Bias is the next thing that I want to talk about. So I think in all subjects over the past couple of years, but certainly in MFL and in classics, we've been talking a lot about decolonizing the curriculum, making our French curriculum less France-centric, for example, and thinking more about the French-speaking territories, the other French-speaking countries. And that has to be a very deliberate action because, a lot of the French textbooks, a lot of the stuff that we find online in French comes from mainland France, because mainland France is a very tech-savvy country. It is very much a country that is online, and so it has a relatively, in terms of French-speaking countries, big online presence. But because it has that big online presence, it means that chances are, when data sets are being selected for generative AI to be trained on, a huge number of those data sets are going to be from France. Not in terms of conscious bias, not because that's what the companies are choosing to train their AI sets on, but just because that's the biggest quantity of information available. That then means that chances are anything that is produced with generative AI is going to have a mainland France focus, a mainland France bias, because that's where the bulk of the data have come from. And again, nobody is to blame here. This isn't a blame game. This is just kind of looking at where the data are coming from and understanding what the AI is doing with it. So again, in order to decolonize my curriculum, in order to decolonize whatever the AI may have produced for me, I've got to look at it and think, is this France-centric? Or does this also apply to Martinique? Does this also apply to Haiti? Does this also apply to Louisiana? Wherever it might be. And once again, I've got to take the worksheet that my AI has generated. I can't necessarily just use it wholesale because I'm trying to decolonize my curriculum. I've got to change it slightly. I've got to change Paris to Port-au-Prince. And that then means also having to change some of the other cultural signifiers within the whole piece. And so now I start wondering, would it have been easier for me to have just written this myself? So we've got to think very carefully about the bias. And I don't like using that term because it sounds very judgy, doesn't it? But it's not. It's just about the fact that certain countries, certain cultures are more prevalent online than others. And if you are decolonizing your curriculum, you've got to be aware of that, and you've got to think about the data sets that your generative AI may be trained on. And once again, that information is not always easy to find out. It's not always easy to come across. So this then does become, I think, the responsibility of the AI creators, these big companies, to make sure that they are using diverse training data sets. But we also have to then make sure that we are not exploiting smaller language models, that we are not exploiting smaller economies, that we are not exploiting other copyright laws. And so that then becomes a whole big thing. I think to close on, the big thing that I learnt when I did this kind of shallow dive into the ethics of AI was that it's all about transparency and explainability. I think all ethics pretty much come down to transparency and explainability. And I think that AI is not always as transparent as it could be. Um, you know, I put a prompt into an AI generator and I trust what is coming out of it. Now, in a teaching sense, as the teacher, I have enough subject knowledge to read through it and go, oh, okay, no, that's nonsense. We've got to refine that a little bit. And then either change it myself or ask the AI to change it, put another prompt in. And, I can do that. Once again, as long as I'm using it as a time saving activity and not oh my God, I haven't planned my year 7 lesson in 10 minutes. Let's just whip something up really, really quickly. So, but again, that's on me as a teacher to be on top of my time management. But there is that element of trust whenever you kind of put that prompt into the prompt box. You are trusting what's coming out, and you are trusting that what is going to come out is going to be better quality faster than you could produce. And we put a lot of trust in these models. We have to trust that what is coming out is not somebody else's blog post wholesale. We've got to trust that what's coming out isn't a leaked copy of the next Chinese bestseller that has been fed through a data set. We've got to trust that creatives, people who are posting online, are not losing out on potential revenue, be that ad revenue, book sales, whatever it might be, because their copyright is being compromised through their data being used as a training set. We put a lot of trust into generative AI every time we type something into that little dialogue box. And I do think in return, we need to be trusted with transparency from the companies in terms of where their data are coming from. Telling me, for example, that your data set is the internet, that doesn't actually tell me anything, because the internet is a very big place. And if anything, that lack of transparency makes me concerned, because I've put stuff on the internet. Does that mean that you have used my data to train your AI? Does that mean that your AI is potentially just going to parrot out this podcast and pass it off as your own? So what I hope is going to happen over the next few years is that these big generative AI companies are going to be very transparent about where their data are coming from and where their AI models are being trained, so that we can then make an informed decision about whether or not we want to use them. Because at the moment, I feel like there's a lot of trust. And that when we choose to use generative AI, we put our trust in it, and then kind of hope for the best. So that's kind of where I am with generative AI at the moment. Like I said, I'm not completely against it. And I am, again, to be very, very clear, I am not suggesting that the companies that are producing the generative AI are acting against copyright or anything like that at all. What I am saying is that in order to use generative AI ethically, we need to make sure that we fully understand the terms and conditions behind every website we upload anything on. And that when we use these generative AI sites, we understand where those data are coming from. Because for me, that's the big thing, is just making sure that we are doing all of this ethically. That was a lot for a Saturday morning. So thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for listening. I very much appreciate you, as always, coming and having breakfast with me. I do believe I am the only show on Teachers Talk Radio today. So I hope that you will spend the rest of the day kind of going back through the archive, not just of me, but of the many, many talented hosts that we have on the platform, and you will listen to some of the cool stuff. There are some really interesting discussions on the platform about EdTech. So if this is your thing, please do go listen to some of the other hosts and hear what they have to say. If I don't engage with any of you over the next few days, I hope you will have a fantastic week, and I very much look forward to having breakfast with you next Saturday morning. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.